The Statue of Liberty stands as one of the most recognizable symbols of freedom and democracy in the world. Rising 305 feet from ground to torch, Lady Liberty welcomes millions of visitors each year to Liberty Island in New York Harbor. Tourists from every corner of the globe make the pilgrimage to this iconic monument, climbing the narrow spiral staircase to the crown, posing for photographs on the pedestal, or simply marveling at the copper colossus from the grounds below. But beneath the inspiring symbolism and breathtaking views lies a darker reality that few visitors consider when they board the ferry to Liberty Island. The very features that make the Statue of Liberty magnificent, its towering height, its location on an island surrounded by treacherous waters, its narrow passages and confined spaces, also make it a site where tragedy can strike without warning. Since the statue's dedication in 1886, the monument and its surrounding waters have witnessed numerous incidents that transformed what should have been the trip of a lifetime into a nightmare of unimaginable proportions. From medical emergencies in the cramped confines of the Crown to boating accidents in the choppy harbor waters, from falls on the pedestal to mishaps during the ferry crossing, the Statue of Liberty has been the backdrop for stories of human tragedy that rarely make it into the tourist brochures. The accidents you're about to discover are not the result of negligence or poor maintenance. Rather, they represent the inherent risks that come with visiting an aging monument located on a remote island in one of the world's busiest harbors. They remind us that even in places designed to celebrate human achievement, nature and circumstance can intervene with fatal consequences. What makes these incidents particularly haunting is the contrast between the victims' expectations and their tragic outcomes. Families on vacation, couples celebrating anniversaries, tourists fulfilling lifelong dreams, all came to Liberty Island seeking inspiration and beauty. None anticipated that their visit would end in death. This documentary examines 7 fatal accidents that occurred while visiting the Statue of Liberty, each representing a different type of danger inherent to the monument and its location. These are not sensationalized tales but rather carefully researched accounts that reveal the very real hazards that exist even in America's most cherished landmarks. From the elderly tourist who suffered a fatal medical emergency in the statue's crown to the boating collision that claimed a life in the shadow of Lady Liberty, these stories serve as sobering reminders of how quickly joy can turn to tragedy. They also highlight the extraordinary efforts of park rangers, emergency responders, and ordinary citizens who risked their own lives attempting to save others in crisis. As you ascend those 354 steps to the crown or gaze up at the torch from the ferry, remember, you walk in the footsteps of those who never made it home. July 14, 1994, started as a perfect summer day for the Henderson family from Columbus, Ohio. Margaret Henderson, a vibrant 54-year-old elementary school teacher, had dreamed of visiting the Statue of Liberty since childhood. Finally, after years of planning and saving, she stood at the base of Lady Liberty with her husband Robert and their 2 adult children, cameras ready to document every moment of their New York vacation. The morning sun reflected off the copper statue as the family entered through the pedestal, joining the stream of tourists eager to reach the crown. Margaret felt a surge of excitement as they began the ascent up the narrow spiral staircase. The 354 steps wound tightly upward through the statue's interior, with only small windows offering glimpses of the outside world and the harbor below. As the Henderson family climbed higher, the air grew warmer and more humid. The confined space of the stairwell meant that body heat from hundreds of daily visitors accumulated with no easy way to dissipate. Margaret paused several times to catch her breath, attributing her fatigue to being out of shape. Her family encouraged her to take her time, and together they continued upward, step by step. By the time they reached the crown observation area approximately 150 feet above the ground, Margaret was breathing heavily. The crown area is notoriously small, with only enough room for about a dozen people to stand at a time, and the temperature inside often exceeds 20 degrees higher than outside. The combination of heat, humidity, exertion, and altitude created the perfect storm for a medical emergency. Margaret's husband noticed her complexion had turned pale, and she appeared disoriented. Before he could fully react, she clutched her chest and gasped that she couldn't breathe. Her legs buckled, and she collapsed onto the narrow platform. The confined space erupted into controlled chaos as her family screamed for help and other tourists pressed against the walls to give them room. Rangers Steve Connor and Dirk Murphy, both trained EMTs stationed at the monument, received the emergency call just before 4 p.m. They immediately began the difficult ascent to the crown, pushing past descending tourists and urging them to clear the stairwell. When they reached Margaret, they found her unconscious, cyanotic, turning blue from lack of oxygen, and experiencing difficulty breathing with chest tightness. The Rangers quickly assessed the situation and realized they faced an unprecedented challenge. Margaret was suffering what appeared to be a massive cardiac event, but treating her in the cramped crown was nearly impossible. They needed to get her down to ground level where they could properly administer CPR and where emergency medical equipment could reach her. Connor and Murphy immediately called for backup and requested assistance from the New York City Police Department's Emergency Services Unit. Within minutes, 2 aviation units and 2 harbor units were en route to Liberty Island. But the real challenge was just beginning. They needed to extract a patient in full cardiac arrest from a location 150 feet above the ground, accessible only by a narrow spiral staircase barely wide enough for 2 people to pass. The Rangers began CPR in the impossibly tight space of the crown while they waited for specialized equipment. Margaret's family watched in horror, pressed against the copper walls as the Rangers worked frantically to save her life. Other tourists trapped in the crown with them stood in stunned silence, the celebratory mood of moments before replaced by the grim reality of life and death. When the NYPD Emergency Services Unit arrived, they brought specialized high-angle rope rescue equipment and a sked extricating device, a plastic stretcher designed for confined space rescues. The team assessed the situation and determined that the only way to move Margaret was to secure her in the sked and slowly lower her down through the statue's interior using rope systems anchored at multiple points. The rescue operation was painstaking and dangerous. Rangers and police officers worked in rotating teams, maintaining CPR on Margaret while simultaneously rigging the rope systems. The narrow stairwell meant that traditional stretcher carries were impossible. The sked had to be lowered vertically through the center of the spiral, with rescuers carefully guiding it past railings and obstructions. For over 2 hours, the rescue team worked to extract Margaret from the crown. The operation required coordinating between teams at the crown level, teams on the stairwell, and teams waiting at the base. Throughout the ordeal, Rangers continued performing chest compressions and rescue breathing, fighting desperately to keep Margaret alive until they could reach proper medical facilities. When they finally reached the pedestal level where the elevator could access them, Margaret was rushed down to ground level. A medical evacuation helicopter had been standing by, its rotors churning the harbor air as paramedics prepared for the transfer. Margaret was loaded aboard and airlifted to Jersey City Medical Center, the closest trauma facility equipped to handle such critical cases. Despite the heroic efforts of the Rangers, police officers, and medical personnel, Margaret Henderson was pronounced dead at the hospital. The autopsy revealed she had suffered a massive myocardial infarction, a heart attack so severe that survival would have been unlikely even if she had collapsed in a hospital emergency room. The Henderson family's dream vacation became a nightmare they would never forget. The very monument that symbolized freedom and opportunity to Margaret became the site of her final moments. In the aftermath, questions arose about the medical screening of visitors to the crown and whether the physical demands of the climb should be more clearly communicated. Margaret's death highlighted a harsh reality. The Statue of Liberty's crown, while offering spectacular views, is essentially a confined space at significant altitude, reached only by strenuous physical exertion. For visitors with underlying health conditions, even undiagnosed ones, this combination can prove fatal. The heat, the exertion, the excitement, all combine to place enormous strain on the cardiovascular system. In the months following Margaret's death, the National Park Service implemented new warning systems. Signs were posted at the base of the statue explicitly warning visitors with heart conditions, respiratory problems, or limited mobility about the physical demands of the climb. Staff began more actively discouraging visitors who appeared frail or in poor health from attempting the ascent. But the reality remained. Lady Liberty's crown would always pose risks to those with hidden vulnerabilities. For Robert Henderson and his children, the memory of that day would haunt them forever. They had encouraged Margaret to make the climb, never suspecting she had an underlying heart condition. The statue they had traveled across the country to see became a symbol not of freedom, but of devastating loss. Margaret's dream of standing in the crown became the place where her heart beat its last. The incident revealed a troubling truth about iconic monuments. The very exclusivity and difficulty of accessing certain areas like the crown created pressure for visitors to push themselves beyond safe limits. No one wants to travel thousands of miles only to turn back at the base. Margaret Henderson paid the ultimate price for that determination. The summer of 2010 brought perfect weather to New York Harbor, and on July 4th weekend, the waters surrounding Liberty Island were particularly crowded with vessels of all sizes. Tourists packed the ferries that shuttled between Manhattan, Liberty Island, and Ellis Island, while private boats, yachts, and tour vessels navigated the busy harbor waters. Among those celebrating Independence Day weekend was 23-year-old Michael Torres, a recent college graduate from Miami visiting New York City with friends. Michael had never been to New York before, and seeing the Statue of Liberty in person was at the top of his bucket list. His group had opted for a private boat tour rather than the official ferry, hiring a small charter vessel that promised closer views and a more intimate experience. What none of them knew was that the operator of their charter boat, Captain Dennis Walsh, had been drinking throughout the morning. Walsh was a veteran boat captain with 15 years of experience navigating New York Harbor, but on this particular day, his judgment was severely impaired by alcohol. He had already consumed several beers before the Torres group even boarded his vessel. As the charter boat approached Liberty Island around 2:30 p.m., Walsh attempted to bring the vessel close to the island's southern shore to give his passengers the best possible view of the statue. However, this area was strictly off-limits to private vessels. Park rangers on shore immediately noticed the boat entering restricted waters and radioed Walsh to move away from the island. Walsh, his reactions slowed by intoxication, responded too slowly. He attempted to turn the boat sharply to port, but in doing so, he failed to notice an official Statue of Liberty ferry approaching from the east, returning to Manhattan loaded with tourists who had just completed their island visit. The ferry captain, seeing the charter boat suddenly veer into his path, blasted his horn and attempted to reverse engines. But at such close range and with both vessels moving at considerable speed, a collision was inevitable. The ferry, weighing many tons more than the small charter boat, struck the smaller vessel on its starboard side with devastating force. The impact was catastrophic. The charter boat's fiberglass hull shattered like an eggshell, and the vessel immediately began taking on water. Passengers who had been standing on the deck were thrown into the air by the force of the collision. Michael Torres, who had been positioned near the point of impact taking photographs, was crushed between the two vessels before being thrown into the harbor water. The scene descended into chaos. Passengers on both vessels screamed in terror. Those on the charter boat who hadn't been thrown overboard scrambled toward the bow as the stern section began rapidly sinking. The ferry captain immediately stopped his engines and deployed life rings, while his crew called in a mayday to the Coast Guard. Harbor Unit police officers arrived within minutes, along with FDNY Marine units and Coast Guard vessels. Rescuers pulled survivors from the water, many suffering from hypothermia, injuries from the impact, and psychological trauma. The charter boat sank completely within 10 minutes of the collision, leaving debris and oil floating on the water's surface in the shadow of Lady Liberty. Michael Torres was pulled from the water by Coast Guard rescue swimmers approximately 15 minutes after the collision. He was unresponsive, with massive trauma to his chest and head from being crushed between the vessels. Paramedics administered CPR as they transported him to Jersey City Medical Center via helicopter, but he was pronounced dead upon arrival. The subsequent investigation revealed that Captain Walsh's blood alcohol content was more than twice the legal limit for operating a vessel. He was arrested and charged with manslaughter, reckless endangerment, and operating a vessel while intoxicated. 7 other passengers from the charter boat sustained serious injuries, and 12 passengers on the ferry suffered minor injuries from being thrown about during the collision. The tragedy highlighted the dangers of the congested waters surrounding Liberty Island, particularly during peak tourist season and holidays when hundreds of vessels crowd the harbor. It also exposed the problem of unlicensed or negligent charter boat operators who put profit ahead of passenger safety. For Michael Torres's family, the Statue of Liberty became forever associated with the senseless loss of their son. He had survived childhood, adolescence, and college only to die within sight of America's greatest symbol of freedom, killed by a drunk boat captain's recklessness. His parents filed a civil lawsuit against Walsh and the charter company, eventually settling for an undisclosed sum, money that could never replace their lost child. The incident prompted increased Coast Guard enforcement in the harbor and stricter penalties for boat operators found intoxicating while carrying passengers. But the fundamental danger remained. New York Harbor, with its heavy traffic, strong currents, and limited visibility, would always pose risks to those who ventured onto its waters to visit Lady Liberty. August 2003 brought one of the most severe heat waves in New York City history. Temperatures soared above 100 degrees Fahrenheit for consecutive days, and the humidity made conditions feel even more oppressive. Despite the dangerous conditions, tourists continued flocking to the Statue of Liberty, unwilling to let weather interfere with their vacation plans. Among those visitors was 67-year-old Carolyn Mitchell from Phoenix, Arizona. Ironically, Carolyn was accustomed to extreme heat. Phoenix regularly exceeded 110 degrees in summer. But the combination of New York's humidity, the physical exertion required to visit the statue, and Carolyn's age created a deadly equation she didn't anticipate. Carolyn had arrived in New York with a senior citizens tour group, 20 retirees traveling together to see the sights of the East Coast. On August 12, their itinerary included the Statue of Liberty. Despite warnings from their tour guide about the extreme heat and recommendations to skip the island visit, most of the group, including Carolyn, insisted on proceeding. They had paid for the tour package and they weren't going to miss seeing Lady Liberty. The ferry ride from Battery Park to Liberty Island offered some relief, with ocean breezes providing temporary respite from the heat. But once the group disembarked on the island around 1 p.m., the hottest part of the day, they were immediately exposed to brutal conditions. The sun reflected off the concrete pathways and the statue's copper surface, creating a furnace-like environment. Carolyn's tour group moved slowly through the grounds, stopping frequently in any available shade. Many group members retreated to the air-conditioned museum and gift shop, but Carolyn was determined to view the statue from the pedestal level. She had come too far to experience Liberty Island from indoors. As she climbed the steps to the pedestal entrance, Carolyn began feeling dizzy. She attributed it to the stairs and continued onward, not wanting to appear weak in front of her travel companions. Inside the pedestal, the temperature was even higher. The enclosed stone structure trapped heat, and despite ventilation systems, the interior temperature exceeded 105 degrees. Carolyn made it halfway up the pedestal stairwell before her body began shutting down. Heat stroke, a life-threatening condition where the body's temperature regulation system fails completely, was overtaking her. Unlike heat exhaustion, which produces heavy sweating, heat stroke causes sweating to stop entirely. Carolyn's skin became hot and dry, her face flushed red, and she began experiencing confusion and disorientation. Another tourist, a registered nurse from Pennsylvania named Janet Holbrook, noticed Carolyn swaying unsteadily on the stairs. When Janet asked if she was okay, Carolyn responded with slurred, incoherent speech. Janet immediately recognized the signs of heat stroke and called out for help while guiding Carolyn to sit down on the stairs. Park rangers responded within moments, but they faced the same extraction challenges that had complicated Margaret Henderson's rescue 9 years earlier. Carolyn was deep inside the pedestal, and removing her required navigating narrow stairwells while other tourists pressed against the walls to allow them passage. Rangers placed Carolyn on a backboard and carried her down to ground level, where they immediately began aggressive cooling measures. They removed her outer clothing, applied ice packs to her neck, armpits, and groin, areas where major blood vessels run close to the skin, and poured cool water over her body. A medevac helicopter was requested, and within 20 minutes, Carolyn was airborne, heading to Jersey City Medical Center. But 20 minutes had been too long. By the time Carolyn reached the hospital, her core body temperature had reached 108 degrees Fahrenheit. At that temperature, proteins in the body begin to denature, organs start failing, and brain damage becomes inevitable. Despite aggressive treatment in the hospital's intensive care unit, including ice baths and cold intravenous fluids, Carolyn's body had sustained too much damage. She died 36 hours after her collapse, surrounded by family members who had flown in from Arizona. The official cause of death was multi-organ failure secondary to heat stroke. Carolyn's kidneys had shut down, her liver had failed, and she had suffered extensive brain damage from the prolonged hyperthermia. The tragedy prompted renewed discussions about whether Liberty Island should be closed during extreme heat warnings. The National Park Service implemented new protocols requiring rangers to more actively monitor visitors for signs of heat distress and to close indoor areas of the statue when temperatures reached dangerous levels. Water stations were added throughout the island, and warning signs about heat-related illnesses were posted prominently. But the fundamental problem remained unsolvable. The Statue of Liberty is an outdoor monument in a location that regularly experiences temperature extremes. Visitors who are elderly, overweight, or have underlying health conditions face genuine risks when visiting during heat waves. Carolyn Mitchell's death served as a grim reminder that natural forces can kill even in America's most visited national monuments. Her tour group completed their East Coast trip, but the joy had been drained from the experience. They had watched one of their companions carried out on a stretcher, and they knew before they even left New York that she wouldn't survive. The Statue of Liberty, meant to inspire and uplift, had instead become the site of a preventable tragedy born from stubborn determination and underestimated danger. April 10, 2025, started as a routine day for Liberty Helicopter Tours, one of several companies offering aerial sightseeing flights around Manhattan and the Statue of Liberty. The weather was perfect: clear skies, mild temperatures, and light winds. It was exactly the kind of day that brought tourists in droves to experience New York City from above. Among the passengers boarding helicopter N216MH that afternoon was the Escobar family from Colombia: Carlos, his wife Maria, and their 3 children aged 8, 11, and 13. The family was celebrating their youngest daughter's birthday with a trip to New York, and the helicopter tour was meant to be the highlight of their vacation. Also aboard was Amanda Chin, a 29-year-old marketing executive from San Francisco, traveling solo and documenting her New York adventure for social media. The pilot, 45-year-old Mark Davidson, was an experienced aviator with over 3,000 flight hours, including extensive time flying in the congested airspace around Manhattan. He had flown the Liberty Tour route thousands of times. It was a standard circuit that took passengers around the southern tip of Manhattan, circled the Statue of Liberty, and then proceeded up the Hudson River before returning to the downtown Manhattan heliport. At 3:08 p.m., 9 minutes into the flight, everything changed. Witnesses on the ground and on Liberty Island reported hearing unusual sounds from the helicopter's engine as it completed its circle around the Statue of Liberty and began heading north up the Hudson River. Video captured by tourists shows the helicopter beginning to shudder and lose altitude. Davidson immediately radioed the heliport that he was experiencing mechanical problems and was attempting to return for an emergency landing. But before he could complete the turn, catastrophic engine failure occurred. The helicopter's main rotor began losing power, and despite Davidson's attempts to auto-rotate, a technique allowing helicopters to glide during engine failure, the aircraft was too low and too close to the water to recover. The helicopter broke apart midair as structural components failed under the stress of the uncontrolled descent. Pieces of the aircraft rained down into the Hudson River approximately 800 yards from Liberty Island. The main body of the helicopter struck the water at high speed, immediately sinking in the 50-degree water. The crash occurred in full view of hundreds of tourists on Liberty Island and on ferries in the harbor. Many initially thought it was part of an airshow or movie filming. The idea that they were witnessing a real disaster seemed too horrible to process. That denial shattered when debris began floating to the surface and emergency sirens echoed across the water. Coast Guard vessels, NYPD harbor units, and FDNY Marine units converged on the crash site within minutes. Divers plunged into the murky, cold water, searching frantically for survivors. The helicopter had sunk to the river bottom in approximately 40 feet of water, and visibility was nearly zero due to churned sediment. Emergency responders pulled 6 bodies from the water. 4, including the 3 Escobar children and Amanda Chen, were pronounced dead at the scene, having drowned after the helicopter sank too quickly for them to escape. Carlos and Maria Escobar were pulled from the wreckage alive but unconscious. They were rushed to Jersey City Medical Center, but both died within hours from a combination of drowning-related injuries and trauma sustained during the crash. Pilot Mark Davidson was the last to be recovered. He had remained strapped into his seat, having fought until the last moment to save his passengers. The autopsy would later show he had survived the initial impact but drowned while trapped in the submerged cockpit. The National Transportation Safety Board, NTSB, launched an immediate investigation into the crash. Preliminary findings revealed that the helicopter had suffered a catastrophic failure of its transmission system, the complex mechanism that transfers power from the engine to the rotors. Metallurgical analysis would later determine that a critical component had fractured due to metal fatigue, a crack that had been developing over many flight hours but had gone undetected during routine maintenance inspections. The crash devastated 2 families and traumatized hundreds of witnesses. For the Escobar family's extended relatives in Colombia, the tragedy was incomprehensible. An entire family, parents and 3 children, wiped out in an instant during what should have been a celebration. Amanda Chen's parents arrived from California to claim their daughter's body, struggling to understand how a routine tourist activity had ended in death. The incident prompted intense scrutiny of helicopter tour safety in New York City. Politicians and safety advocates called for stricter regulations, more frequent inspections, and even a complete ban on tourist helicopter flights. Liberty Helicopter Tours ceased operations immediately following the crash, and several other helicopter tour companies in New York suspended flights pending safety reviews. For visitors to Liberty Island on that April afternoon, the experience was traumatic. Many had been taking photographs of the helicopter, a picturesque addition to their Statue of Liberty photos, when it suddenly plummeted from the sky. Parents struggled to explain to their children what they had witnessed. Therapists later reported treating numerous tourists for post-traumatic stress related to watching the crash unfold. The waters around the Statue of Liberty, usually associated with tourism and leisure, had become a mass casualty site. The memorial service held for the victims took place within view of Lady Liberty, the torch that symbolizes enlightenment and freedom now overseeing a scene of mourning and loss. The crash remains the deadliest single incident associated with visiting the Statue of Liberty in modern history, a stark reminder that the dangers of such visits extend beyond the monument itself to the journey to and from the island. 6 people set out to see one of the world's most famous landmarks and never returned home. September 1998 brought perfect autumn weather to New York, and Liberty Island was crowded with tourists taking advantage of the beautiful conditions. Among them was 32-year-old David Brennan, a construction worker from Boston visiting New York with his wife Sarah for their 5th wedding anniversary. David prided himself on being adventurous and fearless. His construction work regularly took him to heights that would terrify most people, and he often boasted that heights didn't bother him at all. When the couple decided to visit the Statue of Liberty, David was determined to go everywhere the monument offered access, including the outdoor pedestal observation deck that provides stunning views of New York Harbor from approximately 150 feet above ground level. The pedestal observation deck is surrounded by a protective railing designed to prevent falls, but the railing was only 42 inches high, standard for the time but lower than modern safety codes would require. The deck itself can be windy, particularly in autumn when weather systems moving through the region create unpredictable gusts. David and Sarah emerged onto the pedestal deck around 3 p.m., joining dozens of other tourists capturing photographs and admiring the panoramic views. David, true to his nature, immediately moved to the railing and leaned over to get a better view straight down to the grounds below. Sarah, nervous about his behavior, asked him to step back, but David laughed off her concerns. What happened next occurred in a matter of seconds but would replay in Sarah's nightmares for years. A strong gust of wind, later estimated at 40 to 45 miles per hour, swept across the pedestal deck. David, leaning far over the railing with his center of gravity shifted forward, lost his balance. He grabbed frantically for the railing but couldn't maintain his grip. In front of his horrified wife and numerous witnesses, David Brennan tumbled over the railing and fell approximately 150 feet to the stone plaza below. Witnesses reported his scream lasting only a moment before he struck the ground with devastating force. The impact was fatal. David died instantly from massive head trauma and internal injuries. Sarah's screams brought park rangers running to the scene. Ranger Tom Matthews arrived to find David's body on the plaza and Sarah on the pedestal above in complete hysterics. Rangers immediately cleared the area around the body and called for emergency services, though it was obvious no medical intervention could help. The challenge became extracting Sarah from the pedestal deck. She was in severe psychological shock, unable to process what had just occurred. She had watched her husband fall to his death, and her mind had essentially shut down to protect itself from the trauma. Ranger Matthews and a colleague had to physically support her as they guided her back inside and down to ground level, where she was treated by paramedics for shock. The National Park Service launched an immediate investigation into the incident. Engineers examined the pedestal railing to determine if any structural failure had contributed to the fall. They found the railing intact and properly secured. The fall had resulted purely from user behavior combined with unfortunate circumstances. David had leaned too far over a safety barrier, and wind had done the rest. The incident sparked debate about pedestal safety. Should the railings be higher? Should safety netting be installed below the observation deck? Should warning signs be posted about wind gusts? The Park Service ultimately determined that the existing safety measures were adequate and that David's fall resulted from his own reckless behavior. However, they did add warning signs about wind conditions and the importance of staying back from the railings. For Sarah Brennan, the anniversary trip that was supposed to celebrate their marriage became the day her life shattered. She returned to Boston alone, facing the impossible task of planning her husband's funeral and explaining to family and friends how a routine tourist visit had ended in death. She filed no lawsuit. She knew David's behavior had caused his fall, but the knowledge didn't ease her grief or guilt over not being more insistent that he step away from the railing. The incident revealed a troubling pattern. People who work at heights professionally sometimes become overconfident about their ability to handle elevated environments. David's construction experience made him fearless when he should have been cautious. His comfort with heights became a liability when combined with tourist enthusiasm and environmental factors he didn't properly assess. Visitors to the pedestal observation deck still lean against that same railing, take selfies with the harbor behind them, and occasionally test the barriers. Most never learn about David Brennan or realize that someone died doing exactly what they're doing. The plaza below where he landed has been repaired, pressure-washed, and walked over by millions of tourists who have no idea they're treading on ground that once was a death scene. The Statue of Liberty continued welcoming visitors the very next day after David's fall. Flags flew at half-staff briefly, but the monument's operation barely paused. In the world of major tourist attractions, tragedy must be acknowledged but cannot be allowed to interrupt the flow of visitors and revenue. David Brennan became a statistic, a cautionary tale mentioned in safety briefings, and a memory that haunts his widow 27 years later. For most visitors, the ferry ride to Liberty Island is an exciting and enjoyable part of the experience. The boats provide spectacular views of the Manhattan skyline and New York Harbor, and the journey itself becomes part of the Statue of Liberty adventure. But for 71-year-old James Morrison from Dublin, Ireland, the ferry ride on June 15, 2012, became his final journey. James had traveled to the United States with his wife Patricia for a 3-week vacation celebrating his retirement from a 40-year career as a schoolteacher. New York City was their first stop, and seeing the Statue of Liberty was James's primary goal. He had taught generations of Irish children about American history and had always dreamed of seeing Lady Liberty in person. The couple boarded the morning ferry from Battery Park around 10 a.m., joining hundreds of tourists packed onto the vessel. It was a perfect June day, warm but not oppressively hot, with a gentle breeze across the harbor. James and Patricia positioned themselves near the bow rail, cameras ready to capture their approach to Liberty Island. As the ferry departed the dock and headed into the harbor, James felt an unusual sensation in his chest, a tightness and discomfort he attributed to indigestion from breakfast. He mentioned it to Patricia but insisted it was nothing serious. They continued watching the approaching statue, James excitedly pointing out details to his wife. Midway through the 15-minute ferry crossing, approximately half a mile from Liberty Island, James's discomfort suddenly escalated to severe pain. He clutched his chest and told Patricia something was terribly wrong. His face became pale and sweaty, and he struggled to catch his breath, classic symptoms of a major heart attack. Patricia immediately called out for help, and nearby passengers rushed to assist. A ferry crew member radioed the captain that they had a medical emergency on board. The captain notified the Coast Guard and park rangers on Liberty Island that they were inbound with a cardiac patient and requested immediate medical assistance. Among the passengers was Dr. Rachel Goldstein, a cardiologist from Los Angeles who happened to be vacationing in New York. She pushed through the crowd and quickly assessed James, recognizing he was experiencing a major myocardial infarction. She instructed James to sit down, helped him take an aspirin from a first aid kit provided by the ferry crew, and monitored his vital signs as they rushed toward the island. The ferry captain accelerated to maximum speed, alerting Liberty Island rangers to prepare for an emergency medical evacuation. Park rangers stood ready on the dock with emergency equipment as the ferry approached. The plan was to offload James immediately and transport him via helicopter to a Manhattan trauma center, the fastest way to get him to advanced cardiac care. But James Morrison's heart had sustained too much damage. As the ferry pulled up to the Liberty Island dock, within sight of the statue he had traveled across the Atlantic to see, James went into full cardiac arrest. Dr. Goldstein and the ferry crew immediately began CPR, but they were fighting a losing battle. Rangers boarded the ferry with a defibrillator and took over resuscitation efforts. They shocked James's heart multiple times, attempting to restore a normal rhythm, but the electrical activity remained chaotic. For 20 minutes, medical personnel performed CPR on the ferry deck while other passengers watched in stunned silence. Some cried, some prayed, and some stood frozen, unable to process the emergency unfolding before them. The medical helicopter arrived and hovered over the island, but the medical team on scene made the decision that transporting James was futile. He had no viable cardiac rhythm and showed no signs of response to resuscitation efforts. At 10:47 a.m., 47 minutes after boarding the ferry at Battery Park and just yards from Liberty Island, James Morrison was pronounced dead. Patricia Morrison collapsed in grief on the ferry deck. She had lost her husband of 48 years within sight of the monument he'd dreamed of visiting. The other passengers, their excited vacation mood destroyed, stood helplessly as medical personnel covered James's body and Patricia wailed her anguish. The ferry had to remain docked while police and medical examiners documented the scene and removed James's body. The several hundred tourists on board were effectively trapped, unable to disembark onto Liberty Island while the death investigation proceeded. What should have been a 15-minute ferry ride became a 3-hour ordeal. Many passengers later reported the experience was deeply traumatic. They had come for a day of sightseeing and instead witnessed a man die. The incident highlighted a significant challenge for Statue of Liberty operations. Medical emergencies occurring during the ferry transit leave victims in a vulnerable position. They're too far from shore for ambulances to reach quickly, but not yet at the island where helicopter evacuation is readily available. The 15-minute ferry ride creates a gap where patients in critical condition have limited access to advanced medical care. James Morrison's body was eventually transported back to Manhattan and then repatriated to Ireland. Patricia made the agonizing phone calls to their children back in Dublin, explaining that their father had died before even setting foot on Liberty Island. The vacation they had planned for years ended with a widow flying home alone, her husband's body in the cargo hold. The ferry company and National Park Service reviewed the incident and determined that all appropriate medical protocols had been followed. Dr. Goldstein had provided expert care, the ferry crew had responded appropriately, and rangers had done everything possible. James's massive heart attack was simply unsurvivable given the circumstances. But for the hundreds of witnesses on that ferry, the memory lingered. Many reported that their Statue of Liberty visit, which they completed later that day or on subsequent days, felt hollow after watching someone die trying to reach the monument. The statue's symbolism of hope and freedom was forever tainted by the image of James Morrison receiving futile CPR on the ferry deck. Patricia Morrison never made it to Liberty Island that day. She left on the same ferry that brought her husband's body back to Manhattan. She never saw the statue up close, and she never returned to New York City. For her, the Statue of Liberty would forever represent not American ideals but the place where her husband's heart gave out and her life as she knew it ended. July 2017 brought unusually rough water conditions to New York Harbor. A weather system moving through the region created strong winds and choppy seas, making the ferry crossing to Liberty Island uncomfortable but not dangerous enough to cancel operations. However, the conditions created hazards for anyone who might end up in the water. Among the visitors that day was 28-year-old Tyler Chin, a professional photographer from Seattle who specialized in travel and landscape photography. Tyler had built a successful Instagram following documenting his adventures around the world, and his New York series was meant to showcase the city's iconic landmarks from unique perspectives. Tyler had a reputation among his friends for taking risks to get the perfect shot, leaning over edges, climbing barriers, and positioning himself in precarious locations. His stunning photographs justified the risks in his mind, and his growing online fame reinforced his willingness to push boundaries. On the ferry returning from Liberty Island to Manhattan around 4:30 p.m., Tyler positioned himself at the very stern of the vessel, where he could capture shots of the Statue of Liberty receding into the distance with the wake of the ferry in the foreground. The stern area was crowded with other passengers, but Tyler maneuvered himself into position near the back railing. The ferry hit a particularly rough patch of water, and the vessel pitched dramatically. Tyler, focused on his camera and not paying attention to his footing or grip, lost his balance. He stumbled backward against the railing, which at the stern was lower than in other areas of the ferry. His momentum carried him over the railing, and he fell approximately 15 feet into the churning wake of the ferry. Witnesses immediately shouted, "Man overboard," and ferry crew members activated emergency protocols. The captain received the alert and immediately stopped the engines and reversed course. Coast Guard and NYPD harbor units were notified of a person in the water. But the situation was already critical. Tyler surfaced briefly, gasping and flailing in the cold, rough water. The ferry's wake had pushed him away from the vessel, and the choppy conditions made it difficult for him to stay afloat. He was wearing jeans, a heavy jacket, and carrying camera equipment, all of which became waterlogged and dragged him down. Life rings were thrown toward Tyler, but the rough water and wind carried them off target. The ferry maneuvered to get closer to him, but the captain had to be extremely careful not to run over the victim with the vessel or injure him with the propellers. The few minutes it took to reposition felt like hours to the horrified passengers watching from the deck. Tyler went under. He surfaced again, coughing and struggling, but clearly weakening. The cold water, approximately 65 degrees, was sapping his strength and inducing hypothermia. His heavy, waterlogged clothing made it nearly impossible to stay afloat. Witnesses reported that he appeared to be panicking, using all his energy in ineffective flailing rather than controlled floating or swimming. By the time Coast Guard rescue swimmers arrived on scene approximately 8 minutes after Tyler fell overboard, he had disappeared beneath the surface. Divers searched the murky harbor water while surface teams used poles and hooks to probe likely areas. The strong current was carrying Tyler's body away from the initial fall location, complicating the search. Tyler Chen's body was recovered approximately 35 minutes after he went overboard, located about 200 yards from where he had fallen. He was pulled from the water unconscious and not breathing. Resuscitation efforts were initiated immediately, but he showed no response. He was rushed to Jersey City Medical Center, where emergency room physicians continued aggressive resuscitation for another 40 minutes before declaring him dead. The autopsy revealed Tyler had drowned. His lungs were filled with water, and he had succumbed to the combination of cold water shock, hypothermia, and the inability to stay afloat while burdened with heavy clothing and equipment. The medical examiner noted that had Tyler been wearing a life jacket, he almost certainly would have survived. The incident sparked debate about ferry safety and whether life jackets should be required or at least made available to passengers. Ferry operators pointed out that millions of passengers cross to Liberty Island each year without incident and that requiring life jackets would be impractical and create its own safety hazards if passengers had to evacuate quickly. The National Park Service and ferry operators settled on enhanced safety messaging. New warning signs were posted advising passengers to stay seated when possible, to maintain a firm grip on railings in rough weather, and to never lean over barriers. Public address announcements on ferries began including specific warnings about the danger of falling overboard. For Tyler Chen's family in Seattle, the tragedy was particularly bitter. Tyler had survived countless adventures in remote locations around the world. He had photographed from mountain peaks, in deserts, and in dense jungles. He had died in one of the world's most visited harbors, surrounded by boats and rescue resources, doing something as routine as taking a ferry ride. Tyler's Instagram account, which had documented his adventures, became a memorial site. His final post, published hours before his death, showed the Statue of Liberty from the ferry with the caption, "Lady Liberty looking majestic today. Worth the rough crossing. #NYC #Statue of Liberty." The comments section filled with tributes from followers who couldn't believe the vibrant traveler they'd followed would never post again. The tragedy underscored an uncomfortable truth. The waters around the Statue of Liberty, despite appearing calm and controlled, are genuinely dangerous. The harbor experiences strong currents, cold water temperatures, and heavy boat traffic. Anyone who ends up in the water faces serious risk of drowning, even with rescue resources nearby. Tyler Chen's death was ruled accidental, the result of his own risky behavior combined with unfortunate circumstances. But for the hundreds of passengers who witnessed his fall and desperate struggle in the water, the experience was traumatizing. Many reported feeling helpless as they watched a young man's life slip away before their eyes, unable to do anything but throw life rings that fell short and shout encouragement that couldn't save him. The Statue of Liberty had claimed another victim, not through any fault of the monument itself but through the hazards inherent to its location. Tyler had traveled 3,000 miles to photograph Lady Liberty, and he achieved his goal. But his ambition to capture the perfect shot led him to position himself dangerously on a moving vessel in rough water. The photographs he took that day remained on his camera, which was recovered with his body. They were technically excellent, professional quality images that captured the statue beautifully. But they cost him everything. These 7 tragic deaths represent only a portion of the fatalities associated with visiting the Statue of Liberty over the monument's 139-year history. Each incident involved different circumstances, medical emergencies, transportation accidents, environmental hazards, and human error. But they share common threads. Victims who came seeking inspiration found tragedy instead, families who planned joyful visits faced devastating loss, and rescuers who risked their own safety couldn't always save lives despite heroic efforts. The Statue of Liberty continues welcoming millions of visitors each year. The vast majority experience exactly what they hope for: inspiring views, educational exhibits, and memorable moments with an iconic symbol of freedom. But these 7 stories serve as sobering reminders that even the most famous landmarks carry inherent risks. The monument stands as a testament to human achievement and aspiration, but it also exists in the real world where hearts fail, accidents happen, and nature can turn deadly without warning. Lady Liberty raises her torch to light the way to freedom, but for some visitors, that light marked the end of their journey rather than a celebration of liberty. Every death at or near the Statue of Liberty prompted safety improvements, better medical response protocols, enhanced warning systems, stricter regulations, and improved emergency equipment. But no amount of preparation can eliminate all risk. The monument's location on an island requires water transportation. The crown's height requires physical exertion to reach. The pedestal offers spectacular views from significant elevation. These features are integral to the Statue of Liberty experience, and they carry unavoidable dangers. For the families of those who died visiting Lady Liberty, the monument represents something entirely different from its intended symbolism. Instead of freedom and opportunity, they see the place where their loved ones drew their last breaths. The photographs other tourists share of joyful visits are painful reminders of trips that ended in tragedy rather than celebration. Yet the Statue of Liberty endures, as it has for nearly a century and a half. Rangers continue guiding visitors to the crown. Ferries continue crossing the harbor. Tourists continue taking photographs with Lady Liberty rising behind them. The monument itself remains unchanged by the tragedies that have occurred in its shadow. Perhaps that endurance carries its own message. The Statue of Liberty was designed to symbolize liberty enlightening the world, to stand as an eternal beacon of hope and freedom. The monument has witnessed countless personal stories, joyful ones and tragic ones, inspiring ones and heartbreaking ones. It has stood through wars, disasters, celebrations, and sorrows. These 7 deaths, while devastating to those directly affected, are drops in the ocean of human experience that has unfolded around the statue since 1886. The visitors who died at Liberty Island came seeking connection with something greater than themselves. They wanted to stand where millions had stood before, to see what countless others had seen, to participate in a shared American experience. That they died in pursuit of those aspirations makes their stories particularly poignant. They remind us that the freedoms the statue represents, the freedom to travel, to explore, to seek inspiration, come with inherent risks that not everyone survives. As long as the Statue of Liberty stands, people will continue visiting. And tragically, some will continue dying. Medical emergencies will occur. Accidents will happen. The harbor waters will claim victims. But the monument's purpose, to inspire, to welcome, to symbolize humanity's highest aspirations, remains unchanged. Lady Liberty continues raising her torch, lighting the way forward even as she stands sentinel over the tragedies that have unfolded in her shadow.